Then came a swordfish, swooping at the stern as she swung. The wake of her dropped torpedo was clearly visible. On the wing of the bridge, Lutyens was shaking his fist at the plane. "Hard a port," shouted Lindemann, but there was not time to check the turn. The torpedo hit her on her swinging stern, bursting close by the rudder in a shower of spray. A frightful vibration made itself felt throughout the ship, as if the whole vast structure would shake itself to pieces, and she heeled over madly as she continued in a tight turn. "Starboard, starboard!" shouted Lindemann. Down below, the helmsman was struggling with the wheel, while the compass before him still went swinging round over the card. "I can't move the wheel, sir," he said. "Rudder's jammed." On the bridge, the vibration still continued, and the ship still circled. A telephone squawked, and the officer of the watch answered it. "Engine room, sir," he said to the captain. "Captain," said Lindemann calmly into the telephone. Yes, very well." The shattering vibration ceased as he hung up, and some of the speed of the ship fell away. "Portside engine stopped, sir," he said to the admiral. "Portside propellers were thrashing against some obstruction." "Yes," said Lutyens. Another telephone was squawking. "Damage control, sir," said the officer of the watch. "Captain," said Lindemann into the telephone. Yes. "Very well. Get going on that." Then he turned to Lutyens. "Steering flat is flooded, sir. Steering engine out of action. What about the hand steering?" "They've just been trying it, sir, but the rudder's jammed right over. They're trying to clear it now." "The fate of the Reich depends on getting that rudder clear," said Lutyens. In the war room in London, the senior officers were gathered round a chart of a different sort. This was on a scale so large that it showed mostly blank ocean, with only a hint of the coast of France and Spain on the right-hand side. But pinned upon the blank area were several tabs marked conspicuously Bismarck, King George V, Rodney, Force H, Lyon's destroyers. And leading up to each tab were the black lines of the tracks of those ships during the last several hours. The only other feature of the map was a wide arc of a circle marking the limit of air cover from France. A junior officer came over with a message in his hand. "Sheffield has Bismarck in sight now, sir," he said, making an adjustment to Bismarck's position. "She's reporting position, course, and speed." "How long before she's under air cover now?" demanded the admiral. Someone swept with his dividers from Bismarck's position to the arc. 172 miles, sir." "Less than 7 hours before she's safe," said the rear admiral, "and only an hour of daylight. What the devil's Ark Royal up to?" "Here's a most immediate signal coming through now, sir," said an officer. "From Sheffield. Have sighted Swordfish attacking. Bismarck firing." "That's Ark Royal's plane," said the admiral. "Come on, men, come on," said the air vice-marshal. "Most immediate signal from Sheffield again. Bismarck circling." "That's something gained anyway," said the rear admiral. "Not enough to matter," said the admiral. "Most immediate from Sheffield. Attack apparently completed. Swordfish returning." The rear admiral began to speak, but the admiral checked him as the officer was still speaking. "Bismarck still circling." "Then the attack's not over," said the rear admiral. "That's something odd," said the admiral. The signals were clattering down the tubes to be opened hastily, but they were all clearly merely confirmations of what the young officer was announcing from his telephone. "Bismarck heading north." "Heading north?" "That's straight for Rodney," said the admiral. "Perhaps she's still avoiding a plane Sheffield can't see." "I wonder," said the admiral. "Estimate Bismarck speed at 10 knots. "That hardly sounds likely," said the admiral. "Must be pretty well dark there now." Another young officer of the telephone spoke. "Most immediate signal coming through from Ark Royal, sir. First 5 aircraft returning. Report no hits." The air vice-marshal struck his fist in his hand, but the message went on. "Shadowing aircraft reports. Bismarck, course north, speed 9 knots. "Something's happened to her for sure," said the admiral. "Aircraft reports hit on Bismarck's starboard bow." Good, said the air vice-marshal. "But that wouldn't account for it," said the rear admiral. "Ark Royal reporting, sir," said the second officer. "Aircraft reports hit on Bismarck right aft." "That's it, then. That's it," said the rear admiral. "Propellers or rudders, or both." Bismarck, course north, speed 10 knots. There's a heavy sea running, and she can't turn her stern to it," said the Admiral. "Vine'll be up to her in an hour," said the Rear Admiral. "He'll keep her busy during the night. And King George V and Rodney will be up to her by daylight," said the Admiral. "I think we've got her." "I think we have." "Sheffield reporting, sir. Have sighted Vian's destroyers preparing to attack." "Many men are going to die very soon," said the Admiral. "Any orders for Captain Vian, sir?" There was only a moment's pause before that question was answered. "No," said the Admiral. "Vian knows his business. He won't lose touch with her. If she stays crippled, he won't have to force the pace too much. He can wait for the battleships to get her at dawn. If she manages to repair herself, he'll have to attack all out with his destroyers." "Not so easy with that sea running," said the Rear Admiral. "And Bismarck's got a good radar, apparently. The darkness will hamper him, and won't hamper her." "That won't stop Vian from attacking," said the Admiral. "Bismarck is certainly going to have a lively night." "All the better for our battleships tomorrow, then. Her crew must be worn out already. And another sleepless night? But I'm not going to count our chickens before they're hatched. We don't know all that's going on." Deep down in the stern of the Bismarck, all was dark except for the beams of electric hand lamps. There was the sound of water washing back and forth, and the gleam of it, reflected from the lamps, came and went. The working party there was faintly visible. For a few seconds could be seen a man in an emergency diving kit disappearing into the surging water. A little farther forward, a seaman was stringing an emergency wire which brought light to the dark spaces, so that now the dark water was illuminated as the sea surged backward and forward, roaring through the confusion of twisted steel. There were pumps at work as the diver emerged, blood streaming from his lacerated shoulders. He made his report to the officer there, who went back to use the telephone against the dark bulkhead. To reach these, a watertight door was opened for him and shut behind him, although before it closed, the water came pouring in over the coaming with the movement of the ship. A working party was laboring to shore up the bulkhead, and he had to sign to the men to cease their deafening labor before he could make himself understood at the telephone switchboard. In the chart room of the Bismarck, the captain was receiving the message. "Yes," he said. "Yes. Very well." Then, when he replaced the telephone, he addressed Lutyens and the staff officers gathered there. "They don't think any repair can be effected," he went on. "Furthermore, unless we keep our bows to the sea, they think the bulkhead will give away and flood the next series of compartments. So we must hold this course as best we can. That means we go forward to meet our fate instead of trying to run away from it," said Lutyens. "That is what our Führer would like." The Chief of Staff came forward with a bunch of signal forms in his hand. "Berlin has just sent a long message, a resume of all the intelligence they can gather," he said. "The King George V is some 50 miles from us now, bearing northwesterly." The Assistant Chief of Staff opened the reference book to display a series of pictures. "She has 14-inch guns, speed 28 knots, 35,000 tons, completed last year. Renown and Ark Royal? That's Force H," said Lutyens. "We know about them. And there's a force of destroyers very close to the north, probably under Captain Vian. He's the man who captured the Altmark. From the position Berlin gives, they ought to be in sight now." "No doubt they soon will be," said Lutyens. "I was hoping we might have a quiet night before our battle tomorrow." "The men are falling asleep at their posts, as you know, sir," said Lindemann. "Yes," said Lutyens. "And there's the Rodney," went on the Chief of Staff. "She's in touch with King George V, and may even have joined her by now." The Assistant Chief of Staff opened the reference book at another page. 16-inch guns, speed 24 knots, 35,000 tons, completed soon after the last war. 20 years old, said Lutyens. "And I know her well. I launched on board her in 24 at Malta when I was a young lieutenant." And it called for no effort on the part of Lutyens to conjure up the memory. The heat and the dazzling sunshine and the smooth water of the harbour, all so different from this bitter cold and tossing sea and grey sky, and the spotless battleship glittering with fresh paint and polished brass work, the white hand ropes the white uniforms, the dazzling gold lace, the welcoming group of officers on the quarterdeck, as Lutyens followed his captain on board. The salutes and handshakes, the introductions and the formalities, before the English captain led the way below to a wide, airy cabin, the armchairs gay with chintz, the table covered with white linen, the glassware sparkling. "That was the peacetime navy," said Lutyens. If Lutyens could have seen the Rodney now, as she ploughed over the sea towards him, he would hardly have recognized her. A British lieutenant and an American naval lieutenant were at that moment on the boat deck of the Rodney, looking around them at the ship. "The battle's the last thing we expected," said the Englishman. "That's what it looks like," said the American. His eyes traveled over the boat deck and the upper deck. They were piled with wooden cases, secured in every available space. "This Lend-Lease of yours," said the Englishman. "Very kind of you to refit us now. We couldn't do without it. But we have to bring half our refitting stores with us, the things you can't supply because of our different standards." "I know," said the American. "We've 500 invalids on board for Canada," went on the Englishman. "They'll see battle before they see Canada, and their wishes haven't been consulted about it." "Me too," replied the American mildly. "I'm only supposed to be quietly showing you the way to Boston." "Well, that's the old Rodney for you," said the Englishman. "She can't even start off on a quiet trip to America without crossing the bows of a German battleship. We always tried to do our guests well, entertainment regardless of expense. You'll see fireworks tomorrow." "Very kind of you," said the American. "Mind you," went on the Englishman, "it may not be quite as lavish as we'd like. We haven't had time for a refit for 2 years. We're old and we're dingy. But we'll show you something good tomorrow, all the same. When those fellows talk." And he pointed down to the turrets where the main armament crews were exercising. It was a moment of indescribable menace as the 16-inch guns trained and elevated. That was the same moment that Admiral Lutyens looked round at the rather depressed faces all round him and said, "Now, gentlemen, there's no need to despair. 3 days ago, we fought 2 battleships and won a tremendous victory. Now, we face 2 battleships again. Our fighting capacity is unimpaired. We can sink this King George V and its Admiral Tovey. We can make this Rodney run away like the Prince of Wales did. By noon tomorrow, there'll be such an assembly of U-boats around us that no one will dare to attack us. We aren't fighting a battle of despair. We're fighting for victory, and for the German Navy, the Reich, and the Führer." It appeared as if his fighting words had some effect. Heads were raised higher again, and there was animation in the faces of those he addressed. Lindemann looked at the clock. "Another half hour of daylight," he said. "I'll have food issued to the men while there's time, before we darken ship." "Always the thoughtful officer, Lindemann," said Lutyens. And so the last meal was served out and carried round to the men at their posts during the last minutes of daylight. There were men who went on sleeping, men of that half of the crew who were allowed to sleep after the alarm of the attack by the Swordfish had ended, who flung themselves down on the steel decks in their aching longing for sleep. There were men who took a few mouthfuls of food. There were men who ate eagerly, with appetite. And there were the men struggling with damage repair below, who had no chance either to eat or sleep. But darkness closed down from the grey sky so abruptly that even the half hour of which Lutyens had spoken was cut short. The alarm roared through the ship. The sleepers, whom even the alarm could not rouse, were shaken or kicked awake. The voice pipe spoke abruptly to the group in the chart room. "Destroyer on the starboard bow," and directly afterwards, "Destroyer on the port bow." Outside, the darkened ship was suddenly illuminated by the flash of the secondary armament. The guns bellowed. That was the beginning of a dreadful night. As the hands of the clock crept slowly round, alarm followed alarm. "Destroyer to port, destroyer to starboard." And in the outer blackness, Van's 5 destroyers, 4 British and 1 Polish, had made their way to shadowing positions encircling Bismarck. It was not so easy to do in that howling wind and over that rough sea. The destroyers that made their way to Bismarck's port side had to head directly into the waves. The captain and navigating officer on the bridge of the leading destroyer felt the frightful impact as the successive seas crashed upon the forecastle, and the spray that flew aft was so solid that it was impossible to see anything as they looked forward. "We can't keep it up," said the captain. "Slow to 18 knots. At that speed, the destroyer could just withstand the battering of the seas, although the plight of the men in an exposed situation was horrible, and she could go heaving and plunging forward. The lookouts, straining their eyes through the darkness, could see nothing, could not pick out the smallest hint of the vast bulk of the Bismarck battling the waves. The lookout, peering over the starboard bow, was conscious of nothing, strive as he would, except roaring darkness and hurtling spray. Yet, as he watched, the darkness was suddenly rent by the long, vivid splashes of gunfire, pointed, as it seemed to him, directly into his eyes. 4 seconds later, no more. The howl of the wind was augmented by the scream of shells overhead. The sea all about the destroyer was torn into wilder confusion still by a hail of splashes, and plainly, through the lurching and staggering of the ship, could be felt the sharper impact of shell fragments against the frail hull. "Port 15, said the captain, and the destroyer swung away abruptly. Before her turn was completed, the long flashes of the Bismarck's guns appeared again in the darkness, and close under the destroyer's stern, the salvo plunged into the sea to raise splashes, brief-lived in the brisk wind. "Good shooting in the dark," said Captain. "That's their radar." The destroyer's turn had taken her into the trough of the sea, and now she was rolling fantastically, far over, first on one side and then on the other, as the steep waves heaved her over. "We can't take that," said the captain. "Turn 2 points to port and slow to 15 knots. A few seconds after the order had been given, the gun flashes lit the sky to starboard again, and close beside the starboard bow, the salvo hit the water. "Just as well we made that turn," said the captain. "That's good shooting." "And we haven't even seen her yet," marveled the navigator. "They haven't seen us either," said the captain. "This is modern warfare." It was modern warfare. Far down below decks, in the Bismarck, walled in by armor plate, a group of officers and men sat at tables and switchboards. Despite the vile weather outside, despite the wind and the waves, it was almost silent in here. In addition to the quiet orders and announcements of the radar fire control team, there could only be heard the low purring of the costly instrument they handled. Centered in the room was the yellow-green eye of the radar, echoing the impressions received by the aerial at the masthead 100 feet away. The room was half dark to enable the screen to be seen clearly, and in accordance with what that screen showed, dials were turned and pointers were set and reports were spoken into telephones. Save for the uniforms, it might have been a gathering of medieval wizards performing some secret rite. But these incantations let loose 1,000 tons of energy from the Bismarck's guns and hurled instant death across 10 miles of raging sea. It was as a result of what that eye saw that the exhausted men of the Bismarck forced themselves into renewed activity to serve the guns. Now and then, a dazzling flash, star shells soared up from the destroyers and hung over the doomed battleship, lighting her up as if it were day. Sometimes there would be a shadowy glimpse of the destroyers racing to get into position, their bow waves gleaming except when the heavy seas burst over their bows. Half an hour before sunrise, the lookout in King George V was staring through his glasses. "Ship right ahead." At the same moment, the lookout in Rodney also reported, "Ship bearing green 5. "That's Bismarck," said an officer on the bridge of Rodney. And down the voice pipe over the head of the quartermaster at the wheel of the Rodney came a quiet order. "Port 10. Port 10, sir," repeated the quartermaster, turning his wheel. Up in the gunnery control tower, the captain's voice made itself heard in the gunnery officer's earphones. "We are turning to port. Open fire when your guns bear." The gunnery officer looked down at the gun-ready lights. He looked through his glasses with the pointer fixed upon the silhouette of the Bismarck. "Fire," he said. Out on the wing of the bridge stood the American officer and the British lieutenant, glasses to their eyes. Below them, just as on the evening before, the 16-inch guns were training round and reaching upwards towards extreme elevation. Then came the incredible roar and concussion of the salvo. The brown cordite smoke spurted out from muzzles to be borne rapidly away by the wind as the shells took their unseen way on their mission of death. Short but close. Damn close, said the Englishman. The last words were drowned by the din of the second salvo, and he did not speak again during the brief time of flight. But when he spoke, it was in a voice high-pitched with excitement. A hit! A hit! At the second salvo! I told you the old Rodney would do it. Again, his words were drowned by the roar of the guns, and he forced himself to keep his glasses steady on the target. Next, it was the American who spoke. Another hit, he said. The Bismarck doesn't stand a chance now. Down in the radar room of the Bismarck, the same disciplined team was still at work. Range 17,000 meters, said the rating of the screen. There was a roar like thunder then, all about them, as the first salvo hit the Bismarck. The lights went out, came on, went out, came on, and the yellow-green eye of the radar screen abruptly went lifeless. The rating there reached for other switches, clicked them on and off. He tried another combination. Radar not functioning, sir, he announced. You've tried the after aerial? Asked the officer. Yes, sir. No result. No connection with gunnery control, sir, announced another rating. No connection with... Oh, again another rating, but another rolling peal of thunder cut off his words, and again the lights flickered. No connection with the bridge, sir. Very well. No connection with the chart house, sir. Very well. The first wisp of smoke had begun to enter the radar room through the ventilating system. Wisp after wisp it came, seeping in thicker and thicker, swirling in, while the lights burned duller and duller, and peal after peal of thunder shook the whole structure, the shock waves causing the wreaths of smoke to eddy abruptly with each impact, and a section of paneling fell from the bulkhead with a sudden clatter. Throughout the doomed ship, the lights were burning low, and smoke was creeping in thicker and thicker. In the war room, the young officer was repeating the messages heard on the telephone. Most immediate from Norfolk. Rodney has opened fire. King George V has opened fire. Bismarck is returning the fire. Bismarck hit. Bismarck hit again. It was almost possible for the men listening in the war room to visualize what was actually going on. As the Bismarck trained her guns round, she was surrounded by a forest of splashes from Rodney's salvo, and before she could fire, the splashes from King George V's salvo surrounded her. Hardly had her gun spoken before a shell hit the second turret from forward and burst with a roar and a billow of smoke. The blast and the fragments swept everywhere about the bridge. The fabric was left a twisted litter of stanchions, and lying huddled and contorted in it were a number of corpses, among them those of Lindemann, conspicuous by its knight's cross, and of Lutyens. The voice of the officer at the telephone went on describing what was going on. A Bismarck on fire aft. Bismarck hit. Bismarck hit. Bismarck's fore turret out of action. Another officer broke in. Ark Royal signaling, sir. All planes away. Ark Royal? I don't think her planes will find anything to do, but quite right to send them. Conditions were as bad as ever as the Ark Royal heaved and plunged in the rough sea under a lowering grey sky. Yet somehow the Swordfish managed to get away and circle and get into formation and head northwards, low over the heaving sea and close under the drifting clouds. It was only a few seconds before the leader saw what he was looking for. There was a long bank of black smoke lying on the surface of the water, spreading and expanding from the denser and narrower nucleus to the northward, and it was towards that nucleus that he headed his plane. My God, said the leader. Smoke was pouring from the battered, almost shapeless hull of the Bismarck, stripped of her upper works, mast, funnels, bridge and all, and under the smoke, plainly in the dull grey light, he could see a small grove of tall red flames roaring upward from within the hull. But it was not the smoke nor the flames that held the eye, strangely enough, but the endless dance of tall jets of water all about her. 2 battleships were flinging shells at her, both from their main and from their secondary armaments. And from the cruisers, 28-inch guns were joining in. There was never a moment when the Bismarck was not ringed in by the splashes of the near misses, but when the leader forced his eye to ignore the distraction of this wild water dance, he saw something else. From bow to stern, along the tortured hull, he could see a continual coming and going of shell bursts, volcanoes of flame and smoke. And from that low height, as the swordfish closed in, he could see everything. He could see the 2 fore turrets, useless, one of them with the roof blown clean off, and the guns pointing over side at extreme elevation. The other with the guns fore and aft drooping at extreme depression. Yet the aftermost turret was still in action. Even as he watched, he saw one of the guns in it fling out a jet of smoke towards the shadowy form of King George V. Down there, in the steel turret, nestling among the flames, some heroes were still contriving to load and train and fire, and he saw something else at the last moment of his approach. There were a few tiny, foreshortened figures visible here and there, scrambling over the wreckage amid the flames and the explosions, leaping down from the fiery hull into the boiling sea. He swung the swordfish away from this horrible sight to lead the way back to the Ark Royal. While that bombardment was going on, there was no chance of a frail plane delivering a successful torpedo attack. He had seen the climax of the manifestation of sea power, the lone challenger overwhelmed by a colossal concentration of force. He was not aware of the narrowness of the margin of time and space, of how in the British battleships the last few tons of oil fuel were being pumped towards the furnaces, of German U-boats hastening, just too late, from all points in the North Atlantic to try to intervene in the struggle, of German air power chafing at the bit, unable to take part in a battle only a few miles beyond their maximum range. While the squadron was being led back to the Ark Royal, the officer at the telephone in the war room was continuing to announce the signals coming through. Bismarck hit again. She's only a wreck now. King George V turning away. In the war room, people looked sharply at each other at that piece of news. The Admiral looked at the clock. Now, that's the last minute she could stay. They only have just enough oil fuel to get them home. Not 5 minutes to spare. Here's a signal from the flag, sir, interposed young officer. Ships with torpedoes go in and sink her. Bismarck lay a shattered, burning, sinking hulk as Dorsetshire approached. At 2 miles, she fired 2 torpedoes, which burst on Bismarck's starboard side. At 1.5 miles, she fired another, which burst on the port side of the wreck. Bismarck rolled over and sank, leaving the surface covered with debris and struggling men. Bismarck sunk, said the young officer in the war room. Bismarck sunk. And those words of the young officer were spoken in a hushed voice, and yet their echoes were heard all over the world. In 100 countries, radio announcers hastened to repeat those words to their audiences. In 100 languages, newspaper headlines proclaimed, Bismarck sunk, to 1,000 million readers. Frivolous women heard those words, unhearing. Unlettered peasants heard them, uncomprehending, even though the destinies of all of them were changed in that moment. Stock exchange speculators revised their plans. Prime ministers and chiefs of state took grim note of those words. The admirals of a score of navies prepared to compose memoranda advising their governments regarding the political and technical conclusions to be drawn from them. And there were wives and mothers and children who heard those words as well, just as Nobby's mother had heard about the loss of the Hood.